Grove Unleashed.
Fresh jobs report recently. But what I think is so interesting about the jobs report was not necessarily what it reported for August and July, but what it talked about retroactively.
Revisions, right?
Revisions.
So that is the weird part about anything coming from the federal government these days on economic issues, right? They have these big announcement on we created 10 trillion jobs today, right? So you get this splash effect, like the economy's great and everything's great. Now, when I talk to business owners and individuals, there's no one out there that believes we have a strong and a great economy because inflation is just destroying the fabric of society. Without a doubt, we are in a manufacturing recession. We have been for quite a while and stuff. But when you look at the big splash data, you have to go back and see the revision. So they revised negative 818,000 jobs over the past few months. So think about that. For the past few months, they've been promoting all these jobs. We've created this many jobs, and they revise them downwards because they're estimates. And they're just initial estimates. They're preliminary estimates. And we won't know for sure until February of exactly how many actual jobs have been created over the past year. So when you're going into elections or looking at analyzing how government's doing and stuff, you won't know until after the November elections, really, how well the economy has done over the past year or so. So there's a lot of problems with the data initially, but it does show a huge softening in our economy. You know, inflation is still sticky. We have the highest inflation that we've had, and our inflation in Pennsylvania is above the federal
3.4%.
Right.
So we're higher, and then the latest inflation rate for the nation came in at 2.6%.
Right.
Which is still above that 2% index that the Federal Reserve has.
Right, and I think it was 2023, Pennsylvania had the highest inflation increase out of any state in the country.
Particularly in groceries.
Right, so our citizens have been hit the worst by these economic policies pushed out by the federal government. We're seeing it even with Josh Shapiro, right? So it all stems from modern money theory, increasing debt to fund everything, government throwing out money into the economy. That all creates inflation and has really hurt so many individuals across this country. So in Pennsylvania, it has hurt us even more.
So the Federal Reserve recently voted to take the federal funds rate from 5.33% on the average and lower that by 50 basis points. Is that
Percentages.
Is that
Did you go to Yale?
I did. 50 basis points, excuse me. 50 basis points.
Peek you out, basis points.
Is it too soon? Is it politically motivated? What is your view here?
Yeah,
And also, what does that mean?
basis points are just percentage. It's just the elitist way of saying percentage. So it's actually an inside joke. We joke about this all the time.
Winnie the Pooh meme. You know?
Yeah. So when you hear basis points, just think of percentage. So it dropped 50%. So the federal funds rate is basically the interest rate. So your credit card, car loans, house loans, when the Fed increases the federal funds rate, all that goes up. So when they drop it, it all goes down. So you'll pay less interest on your credit card. You should have lower, but that takes time to go through the system. So when they act, it takes months for actually interest rates to start coming down. It also, so the Fed has two jobs, right? Number one, make sure we have manageable low inflation and make sure we have jobs, right? And they tend to be in conflict with each other. So if you have jobs, you have a great economy, which means if you have a great economy, you can have inflation. If you don't have inflation, it means you don't have a great economy, you don't have jobs. So their dual mandate is in conflict at all times.
So it's a balancing act the entire time that they're playing.
It is. It's a constant balancing. So we've had sticky inflation, and when economists say it's sticky, it means it's just not coming down. It's higher. They're trying to get it down. There's one of the big drivers, housing, right? Housing is one of those core indicators for inflation, and it's high. You know, if you're looking to buy a house right now, prices are up. If you're looking at a great time to sell, to make a lot of profit on your house, probably bad time to buy, and that has inventory. There's a lot of things that percolate on why that happens, but it's one of those that's just not coming down. So shelter costs, so to speak. So you have sticky inflation, you have job numbers coming down, and you can see the weakening in the economy. You can see manufacturing not doing well. Inventory is a little lower, so you have some indicators there. The big indicator that I like to look at is what's impacting citizens, because our economy is based on two things. Let me break it down. People spending money, whether they have it or not, and access to capital for businesses. That's it. That's our economy. So when you have high inflation, businesses have higher borrowing costs to go buy stuff, so they have less access to capital, right? Hurts your economy. As people have been given so much money by the federal government, their savings were up, credit card payments were down. After they spent through that money buying stuff, savings are going down, credit card payments are going up. And you're starting to see more car repossessions. You're starting to see more negative economic data on citizens' lives. That means at some point they're going to stop spending. Now you have an issue of they're not spending. Inflation's still out there because government is still spending money. The Biden-Harris administration are still cutting checks and sending money out there. They're still using debt to do it. The Fed is printing money again. So it's killing the finances of the country. And you look at it this way. With this hurricane that just happened, the devastation, the total annihilation of towns and cities in North Carolina, the capacity of the federal government to assist is limited because of all the financial malpractice they've done over the past few years. All of the COVID relief money, large percentage of that went to fraud. Largest financial fraud impacting citizens in the history of the United States. And that's saying something, right? So you have all this debt. We have more debt now than World War II. So we're fighting a war across the world, right? Multiple fronts: Africa, Europe, East Asia. We have more debt, non-war status, right? But we're sending money to Ukraine. We're sending money to Israel, right? Plus all these domestic programs, they're printing money for operational costs. So our debt's high, debt payments high. Our debt payments high because why? The Fed has high interest rates, so we imposed higher costs on ourselves on the debt.
And right now, correct me if I'm wrong, our debt service for the federal government is now higher than what we spend on our defense every year. Is that correct?
Correct. So you see it. The path is coming, right? So you see these individuals struggling to survive, American citizens struggling to survive, and you just see the Biden administration send a $500+ million payment to Ukraine, Israel, and they're sitting there. Where's our help, right? But that's the problem with government. It's those, and it has been built for years. I mean, you're going back to Obama, George W. Bush, using debt to fund operational costs. It has been a continual issue in the federal government. And that's where we're at as a state as well. You go from an $8 billion surplus down to $2 billion, which is going to be eviscerated next budget. $10 billion.
So a lot of people are hearing from the media and from the federal government that inflation is actually coming down. And I guess it's technically kind of true, but not really. And they're hearing so many different things.
Right.
Can you explain for once and for all what is actually happening?
Right. So the rate of increase is coming down. So when they say inflation is down to 2.3%, that means prices are just going up by 2.3%. At one point, they were going up by 9%. right? It was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And that's a compound upon each other. So 5% increase on the previous price, 6%, the 7%. It goes up to 9, and it comes back down. So we're down to 2.3, but it's an increase, right? It's an increase of 2.3%. So prices aren't coming down. The increase is just slowing.
So it's just increasing slower.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now, you also necessarily don't want massive deflation as well, where prices just cave. Like, that's really bad as well. So you want some stability in the price, is what they're trying to go. So the target rate of the Fed is 2%. They want to get it down to 2%, so it just grows 2% too. And the thought process is, wages grow 4 to 5%, prices grow at 2%. You have a growing economy. People actually have more take-home money, and that's the problem. That's what's so upside down about stuff. People's take-home money isn't making the cost, and that's again another economic data point. People are working more part-time jobs because they can't afford life on their full-time job. So part-time jobs are up, and two, I think businesses aren't hiring for full-time right now. They're sticking with part-time because I think business owners kind of see what's coming down the pike.
They're preparing for economic downturn.
Yeah, they are preparing for an economic downturn. Every 10 years, we usually have some kind of recession. We're kind of due, and all that federal money has masked a lot of this economic woes, as well as a lot of the financial woes that are happening in Americans' lives, and really, it has masked over our financial woes at the Commonwealth as well.
So let's move on to the budget. What does our budget look like for this current fiscal year for 24-25?
Right. So our constitutional operating budget, all in, general fund, motor licensing fund, lottery fund, federal dollars, all that combined, over $100 billion. Really on par with Florida's and Texas's budget. But when you look at what we talk about, what we vote on, it's called the general fund. It is the largest account. Sales tax, income tax, all your big taxes go into it. It's about $47.6 billion. That's what was approved. Now, a budget's, we set the maximum amount. So we're basically telling state agencies, here's the maximum amount you can spend this fiscal year.
They don't have to spend it all.
Right. I usually bring that up. Like, they don't have to spend it if they don't want to. They're like, oh, we need all the money. So it's $47.6 billion. It's about a 6% increase over last year, $2.7 billion. And the big issue with that is how it's funded, right? Because you can talk about all this great stuff we're doing, right? We're spending money here, spending money there. It's amazing. The world's a better place because we're spending all this money. The issue is, how do you pay for it? And no one really wants to talk about that because that's the scary part.
So how do you pay for it?
Right. So you have general fund money coming in that's growing roughly between 2 and 3%, right? And you're spending 6. So right there, you're at a gap. I think everybody understands simple math. 6% is greater than 3%. So you're spending more than what you're bringing in. It's a problem.
Right.
Number
so
one.
how have you? This isn't new.
No.
So
this has been an ongoing. It's called a structural deficit. It's been an ongoing theory or an issue really since the Rendell administration in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And there's tons of reasons: policy, economic, demographic. There's tons of issues, none of which has ever been tackled and solved. So the other aspect is this is funded through one-time funds. So we have recurring expenses every year. So those expenses don't go away. We're going to have a minimum of $47.6 billion budget next year, and they'll want to spend more. The governor will come out and say, I want more money, right? Right now, that's all being funded by a one-time surplus that was created because we got a boatload of federal dollars and we supplanted that with state. So we had, when Josh Shapiro took office, he had an $8 billion surplus, $8 billion.
And that surplus was kind of used to backfill where tax revenues were not covering the expenses of the Commonwealth.
Correct.
That deficit that
Correct.
had to be filled from somewhere we had some money in the overdraft account, and that was the surplus, and it was smoothing everything over.
Right. So they're using one-time funds to prop up recurring expenses. So that $8 billion has been drawn down to under $3 billion, somewhere around $2.7 billion. Now, next year's budget will have a gap between revenue and expenditures. That 2.7 is now gone to backfill that, and it doesn't cover that gap. So you'll need to find more money.
So in 3 years, the surplus is gone.
Gone, yeah. Today I can say it is gone. I don't anticipate, unless the governor comes back and says, I am slashing this budget to meet revenues. I don't anticipate him to say that. I don't know where. I'm really interested to see how he actually builds a budget next year with the financial condition we are currently in. So we are underwater. I think the Shapiro administration, House Democrats have committed financial malpractice. I think the citizens are worse off today because of it. They do not care about the long-term financial repercussions of their poor financial decisions. And I think it's going to create a lot of heartache, pain, and suffering for citizens as we move forward, because there are a lot of programs people depend on. And this budget does not ensure the funding of those programs short term.
So in your floor speech on this budget, you talked about being completely factual, but also factually complete,
Right.
so that people have an understanding of what's going on. And always there's going to be calls to cut things and cut this and cut that, and should we cut the General Assembly or should we cut the whatever. But if you look at the budget as a whole, human services and education are about 81% of all general fund spending. 81%. When we take in corrections, state police, and then debt service, we're at 92. So 8% of the federal budget goes towards the General Assembly, the courts, DEP, Department of Labor and Industry,
Park,
DCNR. Right. All of that stuff is just 8% of the budget.
Right.
So when you're talking about making cuts to DCNR or the General Assembly, really you're talking about putting a Band-Aid when you need a tourniquet on other state agencies.
Yeah, it's pennies on the dollar. And when you talk about DHS alone, you're talking about healthcare. It's a financing agency for healthcare. Hospitals, managed care organizations that operate or Medicaid or Medicaid programs. So you have almost double inflation. You have your regular inflation, and healthcare inflation is always higher. So so if you think about it, if you increase DHS by $1 billion this year, and they're growing at 4% off $1 billion and 4% off $2 billion are two very different percentages,
sure.
right? So it creates a compounding issue year after year, and these are recurring costs.
Right.
Like DHS is a recurring cost. It's not like Medicaid's a 1 year, we can put money in there and then it goes away. It's still there. Education funding, it's discretionary. We don't need to put the billions of dollars we do into school districts, but it ends up being a mandated expense because there is zero willingness to eliminate that funding from the General Assembly. It's not going to happen. So you're going to have that level of funding plus add more on top.
And you have to have historic education.
Right. You put a penny in it, it's freaking historic.
Right.
So it becomes this issue of, sure, you want to have the nice things, but you can't afford them. You can't even afford the wants, the necessities. You can't afford anymore. So what gets squeezed out? And that's the problem they're going to have in the future. So you're looking at massive tax increases. And it's not going to be a one-time solve it. If you go back and read Ed Rendell's argument for income tax increase, last time House Democrats were in charge, Senate Republicans were in charge. They've been in charge for like 30-plus years. And then Ed Rendell. So he wanted some 6% increase in income tax. He ended up at a 2 or 3% increase to get to 3.07. If you read his speech and the comments made, this will be the last income tax we ever need. This will take care of it. We won't need it anymore. Like, this will fund government for a perpetual future. It's a one-time. We won't see it. Well, by the end of his term, he needed more revenue. because like you just spend it. The new money comes in and you just spend it. And you just spend it and you just spend it. There's no control.
Well, the IFO interestingly had a report on spending and revenues and looking at the pandemic and how the pandemic affected state spending. And so what it found was that spending increased by 33% since 2018, 2019. Revenues only increased by 30%.
Right.
So is that on par with what you're seeing here, about a 3% gap?
And on top of that, if you remember, that 30% increase in spending was funded through one-time federal dollars. So just simple math.
Sure.
I'm not talking crazy algebra or calculus. Simple mathematics leads any rational person to say we are completely upside down on our finances, and it's not a good.
And the other frightening thing I think is the average dollar increase during the pandemic for our budgets was $2.2 billion, give or take each year, the budget increase. Since Governor Shapiro's taken office, his past two budgets, they've increased an average of $4.6 billion per budget.
Right.
That's almost double.
Correct. So we're not going on a trajectory of financial solvency. And one of my frustrations is actually these credit rating agencies. Like, anybody looks at this finance, how it's funded, it goes against every single criteria credit agencies have that say you are a sustainable, healthy, financial, governmental entity. Now, these are the same people that screwed up the entire mortgage crisis back in 2008, right? Same exact people. They're doing it in government. Every day, they can pull these numbers and see how upside down we are. One of them actually threatened last year to say, if you put tons of money into your education because of the court case, and you don't provide recurring revenue, we're going to downgrade you. Crickets.
Right.
Billions were put in past 2 years with zero recurring revenue to fund it, and these credit rating agencies are completely silent. They're like, go ahead, bankrupt the state, go ahead, just like they did in the financial mortgage crisis. Now, I'm not saying I want Pennsylvania to have higher borrowing costs and a bad credit rating agency, but they have criteria. I've studied them. We don't meet their criteria. There should be a credit rating downgrade, and they're masking it over just like they did during the financial crisis, housing crisis.
So all that, I think, leads us to another point here, that the financial state of the Commonwealth is a direct result of elections. Elections have consequences.
Yep. So do budgets.
Deficits have consequences, right?
Budgets have consequences.
Budgets have consequences. So looking forward to the 2024 election, you've been a little busy recently with some issues that have cropped up. What's going on that front? What are you working on as a legislator?
Right. So, there's a big difference between what happened in 2020 and what's happening here in 2024. Number one, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has not put their finger down on the elections. That has been a critical piece to provide consistency and fairness in our election system. Like, they have generally stayed out of stuff. If you go back to my podcast, I talk about the 2020 election, 2-episode series. It's great. It's amazing. It's a good time. But they have stayed out of it, which has been phenomenal. Let the campaigns work. Let the voters decide. We actually had, there was a colleague of ours who had a primary, heavily litigated. It was a close election, 4 votes, I think. It was a 4-vote primary. So the incumbent ended up losing by 4 votes. But we had a situation where a gentleman showed up to vote and he wasn't in the book. Through research, it was found that when he went in to re-register his car, PennDOT changed his registration to where he was moving to, the new registration of the car. And the weird part is, right, car registration, voter registration, the form comes up, are you sure you want to cancel your registration? Not voter registration, not car registration. If you're there to register, you're like, no, I still want to register. So luckily he knew enough to get a provincial, and the court came back, and it was this whole thing went to Supreme Court because there's a challenge of whether they should or shouldn't count that provisional ballot. So the court came back and said, you know what? We looked at this motor voter system Governor Shapiro set up, the automatic voter registration. They came back and said, you are violating the law. Legally, you're allowed to do driver's license and non-driver ID. Anything else is not provided for by federal law, or by state law. So if you're doing any kind of automatic voter or tying anything else to voter registration outside an ID, you're in violation of the law. 7-0 ruling. Democrats and Republicans. The Democrat Supreme Court is not some QAnon Republican conspiracy theory. It is the highest court we have in Pennsylvania, controlled by, Democrat elected judges. Have said that. So we sent a letter to the governor and carbon copied the Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, and basically sent the ruling and said, you need to curb this back. The court said you can't do it. So we haven't actually ever gotten a reply yet from any of them. But when the newspapers reporters asked about this, their response was, well, voter registration and our driver's registration really wasn't part about our automatic voter registration. It's really not automatic voter registration. It's actually an opt-out. So it leads to kind of two things. One, so we don't have automatic, like you said, like we are automatic voter registration. So we don't have automatic voter registration. It's just an opt-out. So that's problem number one. Like, were you honest with citizens about what you're doing or not? Two.
So it is happening, but it's not happening. But if it is not happening, that's good. But if it is happening, that's also good.
Right. The other problem is they completely ignore what the court has said and completely ignored the legality. I think their one quote was it wasn't a fully vetted case. Like they don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting predicament. Something else is happening. We're going to keep on top of that. We're not allowing them to get away with kind of snubbing the Supreme Court, because this is also a Department of State in the past that has constantly said, oh, we have a court case, we've got to do it. Court case, we got to do it. Well, they finally have a court case they don't like, and it's we're not doing that court case. It doesn't work that way, right? So two colleagues of mine, Representative Fleck and Representative Nelson, have done their own analysis on double voting in the Commonwealth, and that is individuals who are voting twice. Usually it's done in two states, like college student, live in Pennsylvania, go to college in Ohio, you register in Ohio, and you're voting both. Could be like, call them snowbirds, someone that goes to Florida in the winter, you're voting in two places. Could be someone in Pennsylvania that just moves, their old registration wasn't canceled, they're voting twice. That's illegal. One person, one vote. So they pulled up between Ohio and Pennsylvania. They looked at 12 counties and pulled together similar names, and then they pulled up the United States Postal Service's
change of
address, and kind of look like, Seth and Casey Grove moved from Dover, Pennsylvania to Cleveland, Ohio. Does that make sense? And they track that change of address, because how many Seth and Casey Groves live in both places and have a change of address between those two? So, and they sent all that data. They sent it to the Attorney General's office. They sent it to the Department of State, and basically said, listen, some of these could just be two people or similar name, coincidental. Some of them could be people registered in two different places. But the point is, they should be notified they're registered in two places. One should be canceled. And while the Department of State and PennDOT are paying all this money to get people out to vote, they're doing nothing to tell people you shouldn't double vote. And by the way, you shouldn't hand in more than one ballot at drop boxes. So we're talking about trying to stop illegal voting. Because with a double vote, you don't know until it happens. So that vote is counted, and it shouldn't. And that's the problem with the system, right? Once that ballot is counted, there's no pulling it out. It's in there, it's done with, and you now have illegal votes. I just talked about incumbent member losing by 4 votes. Tornek won by 1 vote. At any election, you can have all these close elections where an illegal vote, an illegal double vote, an illegal vote turned in at a drop box could actually sway an election. And the wrong person is now elected into office because of illegal voting.
And I think the important thing is that you're asking the governor and the Department of State to take executive action.
Right.
These aren't things that require legislation. No. These are things that they can do today.
Right. Today, they could go out there and say, you know what? We're going to track this double voting down, and we are going to take it seriously, and we're going to do a PR campaign around stopping illegal voting here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If I were a betting man, I would say they will take no action on any of this stuff.
Anders, do you have any odds on that?
I do not. I was looking for fake news. Pennsylvania man draws penises around potholes so the city will fix them.
Oh, true.
True. And if it's not true, it should be.
Right.
That is true. That is true.
Right. That's totally true.
I got one more here. An Oak Hill community couple discovered a thief in their home Saturday after the husband told a joke and heard laughs upstairs.
This is the hardest one you've ever
Where
done.
at?
Oak Hill. Yeah.
So Oak Hill, husband walks in, hears laughing.
No, he husband and wife walks into their house.
Husband and wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was
the husband tells
walked
the
in
husband
and
tells a
heard.
joke to his wife, and somebody starts laughing upstairs.
That must have been a good joke. Do we know what the joke is?
Did the wife laugh?
Probably not. They never do.
I'm going to say true story.
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
Grove Unleashed.